Hello everyone, and welcome to the Week 6 lecture. I'm going to be looking at our second case study today. Last week we talked about the Northern Territory intervention, and this week we're going to be examining 3 events. These events, the Tampa Affair, the Pacific Solution, Children Overboard, are part of a larger story of people coming to Australia, and they can be analysed using a moral panic lens. Something I would like you to be thinking about on the way through is how beneficial this particular lens is. Is it a good way of thinking about these events, or should we be considering something else? Start off with the story of the MV Tampa. Some of you may already be familiar with this story. It's been a story that's been around for a while now. So it goes back a number of years, August 2001, when a Norwegian cargo vessel rescued a number of people at sea. Mainly, they were people fleeing Afghanistan, and they were Hazara refugees. So Hazara refugees, to put them in context, are an ethnic minority in Afghanistan. They're a group of people who also live in Iran and Pakistan. They're a minority because they only represent about 9% of the Afghanistan population. The majority of them are Shiite Muslims, so there's kind of 2 broad branches of Islam, Shiites and Sunnis, and they represent Shiite, which is opposed to the majority population of Afghanistan, which is Sunni Muslim. They were a persecuted minority. They were the subject of attacks by the Taliban. In 1998, more than 2,000 Afghans, this particular group, Hazara Afghans, were killed in 3 days. From 1999, many of them fled and therefore became refugees. They were looking for a place of refuge in the world. Early refugees had fled from 1979 because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. In 2011, we had 28,000 or more than 28,000 Afghanistan people living in Australia. They're the people that were primarily picked up by this Norwegian cargo vessel. And the captain of the ship brought that vessel just to outside of Christmas Island. They brought the ship there, and then the Australian federal government, which was a Liberal National government at the time, refused the captain entry to Australia. And that was kind of the reason why I start with this story, was that that's the beginning of a whole series of connected events, which include the creation of what's called the Pacific Solution, refugee advocates bringing the federal government to court, the Children Overboard affair, which I'm going to talk about as well. The beginning of it coincides, a month later with, or less than a month later, with the war on terror and the September 11 attacks on New York, and an election campaign and an electoral success by the Howard government. I left that question there again because, again, I want us to think about what, if anything, does a moral panic framework bring to understandings of this and the other events I'm going to talk about. According to Marr and Wilkinson, the problem for boat people, which I am problematising, is always the boat. It's the symbol of Australia's fear of invasion. They say people worried far less, indeed hardly at all, about asylum seekers seeking arrival by air, even though they were jumping the same queue, because that's one of the criticisms of people coming by boat, that they're jumping some sort of queue. There were far more of them coming by air, and they were about half as likely as those who came by sea to be genuine refugees. Air arrivals were released into the community, and though their numbers rose through the 1990s, this was not seen as evidence that Australia was failing to police the borders. The arrival of boats, however, was seen as a failure on Australia's part to be policing our borders. The idea behind that is that we are an island nation, and therefore we're kind of vulnerable to invasion. And another idea is that Australia as a nation, as a federated nation since 1901, has actually we've understood ourselves really as being not just geographically isolated, but also racially isolated in this particular region, and therefore exceptional because our heritage has been white and in particular British. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, the White Australia policy, that should be policy, not police, but I'm not sure what the difference is in this case. There's a bit of a conflation between police and policy. The Immigration Restriction Act was actually our first very substantial piece of legislation that was passed after the states and territories came together as a federated nation in 1901. And there was concern at the time about coloured people or people coming specifically really from China. That was the largest concern. So the Act was a legislative recognition of the White Australia policy. We'd always had something in place, but this is where we made it very clear as one of our founding rules that we were to be a white nation, a white Australia. And the Act then created procedures to exclude people from Australia, including what's called the infamous sort of dictation test, which applied to non-Europeans. So if you were a European, it didn't apply to you, but if you were non-European, it applied between 1901 through to 1958, where applicants had to write out 50 words in any European language, so they're non-European people, but they have to show knowledge of a European language. And that was dictated, the language that they were to use was dictated arbitrarily by the immigration officer. So he could say, well, write something out, 50 words in German, and if you didn't know German, then you could be deported. So it was a way of weeding out people that were deemed unsuitable. We had, as you would know, from conversations last week in our tutorials, I think most of you knew about the Second World War. It was certainly a discussion that you did have in high school, so you're probably aware about this huge global refugee crisis which did happen after the Second World War. And that brought more people into Australia. Although for a while, as I said, that dictation test went through to 1958 and the Second World War finished in 1945. And we did accept many refugees, no doubt about that, and in the 1950s, an increased number of people coming from Greece and from Italy as well. However, the preference was still for supported migration, and this was often in the form of cheap fares for people to come from England, what we call fondly or disparagingly £10 POMs. So we had very cheap fares for people to come from England in particular through to Australia to migrate after the war. And we also favoured refugees who could be identified as kind of our Nordic cousins, particularly white and blonde, from the Scandinavian regions. The political debate in Australia still reflected, though, this kind of deep uncertainty about people coming to Australia and whether they were genuine refugees. So for many people, they used the language of it being a racket. It was the refugee racket. People were seen as taking advantage of Australia, really. The man pictured there is Herbert Evatt, who was a former Justice of the High Court, but he was also the first president of the UN, the United Nations General Assembly, in 1948, so that's 3 years after the Second World War ended. And he presided over the adoption and proclamation of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which I think is a fantastic distinction for an Australian, on the 10th of December at the end of 1948. And this was followed then by the Geneva Convention and the Genocide Convention. And these were instruments that were developed by this group of people as a form of obligation towards something that they called a common humanity, which included in 1951 the proclamation and adoption of the Convention on the Status of Refugees. So this convention was a key legal document that defined who is a refugee and what the rights and legal obligations of the various nation states around the world are to the refugees. And it becomes a universally accepted norm then from that time, so it's both legal and a social norm and an indication of what a civilised community will do on behalf of those who are seeking asylum. Article 14 in particular states every person has a right to seek asylum in any territory to which they can gain access.
And the term refugees applies to any person who, and I'm quoting, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable or owing to such fear, unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, and who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence as a result of such events, is unable or owing to such fear is unwilling to return to it. What in that language gives away the fact that this was written prior to the second wave feminist movement? It says his all the way through, so it's kind of the man standing in for the human in that. We wouldn't write it that way. We would use he or she or they these days. And we as in Australia acceded to and ratified that convention in 1954 at the height of what's called the Cold War. Our Migration Act in 1958 generally relaxed procedures and laws, so it didn't totally remove the White Australia policy, but we had more of an attitude of relaxing the rules related to people coming to Australia and the conditions under which they could arrive and leave again. We replaced that dictation test with the visa system instead. We had the authority of the minister who could make decisions on behalf of people. And the incorporation of the convention into domestic law therefore made it legal for an asylum seeker to arrive in Australia and seek protection under the law here. And there was also an obligation on the part of the Australian state not to send asylum seekers back to their country of origin that they were fleeing from for reasons of persecution. And that's known under international law as the doctrine of non-refoulement. Later on, we've got kind of a turn to multiculturalism where we move away from singling out, even though we've always preferred migrants from white nations, but we moved away from that a little bit and started to embrace people from other nations as well, which we tended to call New Australians. And then the last of that White Australia policy was removed in 1973, so that we could, as Prime Minister at the time, Gough Whitlam, said, so that we could turn a decent face to the world, because by now, in the 1970s, the White Australia policy was starting to look a little bit embarrassing. And then the work of the Immigration Department, which was enabled through this Migration Act, was to make sure, though, that these very new Australians were chosen with great care. So we've kind of always wanted to keep control of, I guess, the character of people who come here, which is the point that David Marr says, control, selection, choice, or everything a bit fussy. So then we have the situation of so-called boat people arriving, first of which arrived in 1976, when people began to arrive from Vietnam as a result of the Vietnam War in which we were engaged, and after the fall of Saigon. We did accept many Vietnamese people and also later Cambodian refugees as well, and they were fleeing persecution and conflict, of course, in their own nations. We worked very hard, however, according to some commentators, to control the process. So we chose refugees from camps in Thailand, Malaysia and Indonesia, and then worked diplomatically with those countries to ensure that people were processed outside of Australia. I always find that an odd word to use, process, but I guess it's talking about the paperwork and checking people's records. It makes me think of a factory, really, but I guess it's kind of like that in some ways. The few opinion polls that were conducted here on the question of asylum seekers and arrivals by boat in 1979 indicated extreme antipathy by the Australian people to Asian arrivals, especially those who simply turned up uninvited, as some of these people did from Vietnam. And this is very much, you know, as a young woman at the time of this, I'm very aware of this as being part of my story as well. For most of you, this is ancient history, but it's not for me, and I'm very aware of the anti-Asian sentiment that I have grown up with. This has been around for a long time. And in 1976, we opened the first immigration detention centre at Villawood in New South Wales. We then had a small influx of asylum seekers after 1981, after the Tiananmen Square protests in China. And then after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, then we got some more Russian asylum seekers coming here. In 1989, we had the Migration Legislation Amendment Act, and that was introduced by the Hawke Labor government, which was to deter and intimidate illegal entrants. So we've had this long concern about people coming to this country, who's coming to this country, and what their status is. And then in 1992, the Keating Labor government introduced mandatory detention for non-citizens who arrive in Australia without a visa. So if you haven't got the proper paperwork, if you haven't been processed beforehand, then you needed to go into detention. And this legislation, which had bipartisan support, didn't allow for any judicial review, but did limit the time that you were going to be in detention for to 273 days, which was later removed. So mandatory detention, locking somebody up because they've arrived without the appropriate paperwork, there's no precedent in the Western world for that. That's something that we have the dubious honour of being unique in. And it was understood to be in breach of a number of these UN conventions. I mentioned the United Nations before, including the rights of the child, and perhaps Article 37 is the right one there. But it did have very popular support. 1993 poll showed almost complete support for the policy in the community. 44% of people wanted to see all so-called boat people barred from settling in Australia. Both parties, I'm talking there about the major parties, Labor and Liberal, didn't campaign directly on issues of border protection throughout most of the 1980s. And in fact, John Howard made very disparaging comments about Asian people, and that cost him an election. But in the mid-1990s, the political rhetoric, the discourse, the language that was coming out of Canberra began to describe people who are asylum seekers as simply illegals. And that language then filters through into the general consciousness. Or even though they're not illegal or queue jumpers, because it's legal, according to that UN convention, which we've ratified in Australia, to be seeking asylum. We did then have a rise in asylum seekers after John Howard became Prime Minister in 1996. The numbers of people seeking to come to Australia increased, which was in response to geopolitical affairs, particularly in Afghanistan and Iraq, wars that we've participated in. And there was an estimate around 2001 that there were 22 million refugees seeking asylum worldwide. And of those 22 million, we had 9,461 applications lodged in Australia, compared to Britain, where there were more than 39,000, Germany 66,000, Canada 31,000. So we kind of got this idea of returning to people doing things our way, which is a return to assimilation. And this is Pauline Hanson's first speech to the House of Representatives back in 1996. And she says, immigration and multiculturalism are issues that this country is trying to address, but for far too long ordinary Australians have been kept out of any debate by the major parties. I and most Australians want our immigration policy radically reviewed and that of multiculturalism abolished. I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians. Between 1984 and 1995, 40% of all migrants coming into this country were of Asian origin. They have their own culture and religion, form ghettos and do not assimilate. Of course I will be called racist, which she has been many times, but if I can invite whom I want into my home, then I should have the right to have a say who comes into my country. A truly multicultural country can never be strong or united. And I remember dinner party conversations around this woman who was saying what in our household were really outrageous things. It's Tampa, August 2001. Let's go back there. So the Convention of Sea Rescue, so a convention, a social norm, not a law, is that ships nearest to a wreck are obligated to rescue and prevent loss of life. That's their obligation. That's what they try to do. And that's accompanied by the convention that in the aftermath of rescue, after the rescue, the closest territory would then take the people who needed rescuing. Australia refused that, as I said. The Norwegians were of the view that Australia would come to our senses once they had some skilled advice on shipping law. So in the midst of that standoff at sea on the 29th of August, the Howard government rushed the Border Protection Bill 2001 through the House of Representatives. And it received bipartisan support. And I have to stress that all through this debacle, these long stories, both Labor and Liberal have been supporting each other over these issues. And I went from being a long-standing Labor supporter to not wanting to go near them. The bill aimed to give authority to the military to detain ships and then remove them from territorial waters. So we excised territorial waters from our sovereign borders. So we had limits now. So places like Christmas Island, Nauru were outside of it. And what we then aimed to do with that act, or the Howard government, was to make that retrospective as well from the time that the Tampa arrived. The bill was initially defeated in the Senate, but then passed on the 17th of September and was introduced into law on the 18th of September. Now, on August the 30th, the rescuees, the people that had been, saved by the Norwegians, handed a letter to the Norwegian ambassador on board that ship, the Tampa, and it was signed by these Afghan refugees, and it stood as notice to the Australian government that they were seeking, according to that 1951 convention, they were seeking asylum. And part of it reads, "We do not know why we have not been regarded as refugees and deprived from the rights of refugees according to international convention. We request from Australian authorities and people not to deprive us from the rights that all refugees enjoy in your country, in the case of rejection due to not having anywhere to live on the earth, and every moment death is threatening us. We request you to take mercy on the life of 438 men, women and children." So under the Migration Act, those arriving without a visa could be detained while their applications for refugee status were heard and processed. So remember that we want the paperwork done first. But in the case of the Tampa, Minister Ruddock, who is the man here on my right, had been in the press announcing that none of the refugees would be given the opportunity to enter Australia at all. And that would deny these people who'd been rescued the opportunity to access any protections then of the Refugee Convention that were already built into our Migration Act. Because the government were not processing these people who'd been rescued, weren't processing their claims for asylum, it was argued that the government was unlawfully detaining those on board. And the government argued that the rescuees were free to go anywhere in the world, but they weren't free to come to Australia. So this led to something called Pacific Solution. What do we do with these people? We don't want to let them into Australia, so what are we going to do? It did go to court though. So the Tampa case was taken to court, and it was taken to court by Eric Vidalis, who was a human rights lawyer living in Melbourne, and also the Victorian Council for Civil Liberties. So it went to the federal court on the 31st of August 2001, and then the presiding judge, Justice North, postponed the full argument until the next morning, the 1st of September. And these dates are actually quite important. On September 1, John Howard announced the Pacific Solution, which was to have people processed offshore, away from Australia, on places like Christmas Island, not brought into Australia. And it meant that asylum seekers could not invoke any domestic, if they were offshore, they couldn't call on any domestic laws to support their claims. So they could no longer say, well, according to your Migration Act, you've signed the UN Convention, therefore you're obligated to let refugees in. The Commonwealth legal team argued that this substantially changed the facts and that the case should be concluded that day, so the Pacific Solution could then commence operation. Justice North held instead that the trial would begin later, a day later, on a Sunday, on September the 2nd. Those people who'd been rescued from the Norwegian vessel were then transported, some of those to New Zealand and some to Nauru on the 3rd of September. On September 11, Justice North made a public statement about his decision in the Tampa case. He held that the Cabinet breached one of the most basic legal principles, that a person, whether they were a citizen or not of Australia, could not be held in detention arbitrarily, which is what was happening when people were sent offshore. The orders of the court, he said, will require that the respondents release the rescuees onto the mainland of Australia. Given the practical issues that arise in releasing the rescuees and bringing them to Australia, and the agreement reached by the parties, I have allowed a short delay so that the release must be completed by 5 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on Friday, the 14th of September 2001. So he ordered the government to bring the rescued people in. But then on September 11, 2001, the date before that, the world changed and we had the attacks on the Twin Towers in New York. And that event really has changed the world. It became kind of the defining threat, at least facing the Western world. John Howard was in Washington at the time. And then that relationship between those terrorist threats and then the later war on terror, which developed around that, became all caught up with the ongoing crisis over border protection and this Pacific solution. So that the Commonwealth, what they did was do an appeal. So if you lose a case, as you would know, you can then take it to a higher court and appeal that, which the Commonwealth did, and they appealed that on the 12th of September, and that was heard on the 13th of September. And of course, the pressure was immense and the timing was really important as well. And Howard told the press from Washington that this is a matter that relates to the integrity of Australia's borders, and the integrity of our borders is surely a matter for the democratically elected governments, so for the governments to decide, not for the courts to decide. And then Justice French, who was presiding in the Supreme Court, delivered the majority opinion that the power to determine who may come into Australia is so central to sovereignty that it is not to be supposed that the government of the nation would lack, under the power conferred upon it directly by the Constitution, the ability to prevent people not part of the Australian community from entering. The Melbourne lawyer lost on appeal. On October the 5th, an election was called. On October the 6th, HMAS Adelaide intercepted, so one of the nation's boats intercepted an Indonesian wooden boat which sunk. There were 223 passengers on board, and plus the crew, and they were just off Christmas Island. On October the 7th, so all of these events are happening very quickly. Philip Ruddock claimed passengers had threatened to throw their children overboard in order to be allowed to come into Australia. So if you don't let us in, don't pick us up on this boat, then we're going to throw our kids overboard, which of course everybody was horrified at that thought. That's not the sort of people that we want in Australia, people who would throw their children overboard. That statement was repeated by our Defence Minister of the time, Peter Reith, and Prime Minister John Howard, that there were people who were willing to threaten the lives of their children in order to come to Australia. That became, kind of been reliving all this as I've been preparing all this, it became a headline political issue. There wasn't any other conversation in Australia, I can tell you, around about this time. And so, of course, the election campaign was then fought on issues of national sovereignty and also of border protection as well. And we had all of the panic at the time associated with 9/11. And Howard's campaign launch speech said, "We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they came," and which kind of echoes what Pauline Hanson was saying back in 1996. And on November 10, that Howard government was returned with an increased majority. There was an inquiry, though, into the assertions that people who had been, the Indonesians who had been rescued by the HMAS Adelaide, had thrown their children overboard. And there were pictures with children bobbing around in water. And so there was an inquiry, a Senate Select Committee inquiry, 12 months later. And the key question was, by this time we all knew that was a lie, that was not true, that it didn't happen, that the people bobbing around in the water was all of the people from, or many of the people who, through the sinking of the Indonesian boat. It wasn't that people were selecting children to be overboard. So we all knew that. So the question for the inquiry became, why was the false claim that children had been thrown overboard made in the first place? Why did anybody ever say that? Why did anybody think that when we just had a ship sinking in the first place? And why was it not corrected or retracted prior to the federal election on the 10th of November 2001. The findings were genuine miscommunication or misunderstanding, inattention, a public service culture of responsiveness and perhaps over-responsiveness to the political needs of the ministers, which I interpret as people rushing around to do what the minister wants and not acting with their own integrity, and then deliberate deception motivated by political expedience. So you can easily see that this could be interpreted as the Liberals saying, hey, wow, this is fantastic. We can put a great spin on this for the election. Everybody will be saying, totally, we do not want these sort of people coming to Australia, and they'll be backing us. So the findings from the inquiry were no children were thrown overboard from that boat. A report that a child or children had been thrown overboard arose from a telephone conversation from the commander of the Australian boat, which occurred between two people, which occurred on the 7th of October 2001. And then photographs were released to the media on the 10th of October as evidence of children thrown overboard. Were actually pictures taken the following day, the 8th of October, while the boat was sinking. So they were used by the media falsely. And then by the 11th of October 2001, the naval chain of command had concluded. So not very long afterwards, 3 days afterwards, the naval chain of command had concluded that no children had been thrown overboard, and the Chief of Defence was informed that there were at least serious doubts attaching to that report. So we knew very early. However, officially it took a while. And on October the 11th, 2001, Minister Reith and his staff were separately informed, so they had been told that the photographs were not of the alleged children overboard events of the 7th of October, but were of the sinking boat on the 8th of October. So they knew and yet continued to perpetrate a lie, which raises questions for me around whose lives are afforded legal and political protection, not just in that situation, but other ones as well. People who did die, why were their lives not grievable? How are asylum seekers dehumanised? And they were certainly dehumanised in that story, that we wouldn't want people who would threaten the lives of their children to save their own lives. We wouldn't want those, so they were dehumanised. And again, that question, does moral panic offer any lens upon which we can understand processes of dehumanisation? So I think in terms of those stories, this could fit either the American or the British model, very much like the Northern Territory intervention again, so it could fit the original moral panic theory. There was a concern that people were arriving, and there's no doubt that at some point, I think it's about 2011 and 2012, was kind of the peak of a number of arrivals coming by boat of about 20,000 people, so quite a considerable number. So there had been concern that there were increasing numbers of people arriving, so-called illegally. It's not actually illegal. There was a lot of hostility, and there was a lot of hostility because of September 11, because people were told that people were arriving illegally, and in the main, I guess Australians are law-abiding, even though I jaywalk. So there was a great deal of hostility towards people who weren't doing the right thing, and of course the cap of that was people threatening to throw their own children, or having done that as well. So a great deal of hostility towards people. So they were the folk devils, and I think they're racialised folk devils as well. There was a consensus, there was absolutely a consensus in the media. There was a media that published those stories, and it took them a while to retract them and to tell the truth. Both of those major parties and community support as well. There's always been a counter-narrative, but it took a while for that to gain momentum and to be heard in the media as well. Disproportionality, is that there? Yes, I think it is. When we consider, there's no doubt that more and more people were coming to Australia by boat, so you can see that. But if we look at the numbers of people who were fleeing war situations in Syria, etc., and the volume of refugees in Europe, then I think our fear was disproportionate to the global demand. Volatility, yes, and I think those policies are still largely intact. And there is absolutely a legacy. I think media attention is increasing now and doing more humanising stories of asylum seekers and refugees. So I think that has changed, but I think I could, on these initial stories and changes legislation, use the original moral panic theory. Claims makers, the major ones, were definitely the government at the time, but in concert with the media as well. So the legacy, what have we got left? We do have bipartisan support, which is what we had with the Northern Territory intervention. Remember, that's what both of these lectures have in common, is bipartisan support. Both the Labor and the Liberals are in concert around this. So bipartisan support for offshore detention. Since August 2012, approximately 4,177 refugees and asylum seekers were sent offshore to Nauru and Manus Island, which is a part of Papua New Guinea. Approximately 500 have been resettled in the USA. Some have returned to their home countries, about 800. Some have resettled in Cambodia. You may be aware that we have had campaigns over a number of years to get children out of detention. So it's not like there haven't been activist groups and concerned people in the community wanting to do something, at least remove children. And the last 4 of those children were removed in February 2019. So it's not as if there weren't people doing something, but when it comes to the people who have power in the community, that's where there was bipartisan support, and I think still lots of support in the majority of the Australian community. But we've had increasing attention from the media on conditions in Nauru and Manus Island and Christmas Island, and questions around the treatment of people there, the way in which medical professionals would have to sign non-disclosure agreements, so like they'd have to, in order to work there, they'd have to sign off a contract saying that they would never tell anybody about anything that was happening in the detention centres. So which is always suspicious. If you can't be transparent, then there's a problem. So it's not as if. So it's interesting to me that we've had this gradual turnaround in the media in support of asylum seekers and refugees, but still a lingering legacy. So that's another example from 2014. But it's taken a long time, if you think about it, 2014. And I just wanted to mention, we've even had now, I think this is a major embarrassment for Australia, or I feel embarrassed anyway, that we had a Manus Island refugee, Baruz Bachuni, who has won a really prestigious and quite rewarding, financially rewarding prize. I think it's about $100,000. He's won this literary award, and he did that inside a camp by texting his story in Farsi, which is his language. He's from Iran, texting that to a friend who then translated for him. And so he wins, so we lock him up. He was a journalist, a well-educated man. We lock him up in a detention centre, and then he wins a literary prize, and we still don't want him here in Australia. And you go, this doesn't make any sense to me. But he's done his own discourse analysis. Remember, we talked about discourse analysis, and he's written an article for The Guardian. And he reckons if we pay attention to the discourse and propaganda techniques of consecutive governments, so this includes Labor and Liberal, over these years we notice that essentially the same language and rhetoric has been maintained without the slightest change. Every government has imposed the same logic on society. The policies have been designed and implemented to stop the boats, and certainly the Liberal government is not embarrassed about that at all. As a result of this simplistic reasoning, they have justified an inhumane political program. And he goes on to say that the most prominent slogan for groups opposing this policy over all these years, and there have, as I said, lots of people actively going out to detention centres and protesting and writing to the ministers, etc. So there have been good people in the community working hard. What they have been saying is bring them here. That slogan has been the basis, he says, for many pro-refugee activist groups and featured in lots of campaigns to free the refugees from these prisons. Unfortunately, he says, this slogan and these campaigns have been unsuccessful in achieving their objectives, and there's no doubt about that. They have been unsuccessful. So he goes on to say that the exile and incarceration of refugees on Manus, and think about that different language, instead of having a detention centre, he's now using the language of incarceration and prisons, on Manus and Nauru is based on 3 fundamental pillars. He reckons there's political profit from both political parties, partly because of the widespread support in the community. There's economic gain, so the big companies that are running those detention centres or prisons gain financially from doing so. And he also reckons there's an ideological basis which is associated with the individual psychology of people such as Dutton, who's become enormously powerful, and his portfolio has increased in power over time as well. So he reckons that's the real problem. The slogans don't, even though it's well-meaning and we want people to keep on being in support of asylum seekers and refugees, he's arguing that we're not actually getting to the root of the problem.
After 6 years incarcerated in Australian offshore detention, and with the help of supporters, Behrouz Boochani made his way to New Zealand late 2019. After staying beyond his 1-month visitor visa, he claimed asylum and was granted refugee status in July 2020.
I was sure that one day it will finish because they cannot keep us there forever. Always I was saying, you are not going to die in this island. Yeah, you no have right to die in this island.
Hello, sir. So good to see you. I mean, it was a long process to get Behrouz out, and even when he got to the airport, we were nervous. And we were nervous the whole trip because he was flying on a UN passport, and these are always viewed differently by different governments. We knew he had to transit on the way to New Zealand, and we really weren't sure what was going to happen in transit or what the New Zealand government would ultimately do, even though they'd granted him a visa. So it was a very nerve-wracking experience.
I was traveling with a UNHCR blue passport. So in Port Moresby airport, they asked me many questions and they created a very stressful time for me and the friends who were with me. They called many places, even they called New Zealand immigration, I think, just to become sure. Everything was legal, but they were suspicious at me. So finally they let me get in the plane. So the first step finished.
The obvious way was to come through Australia, but clearly he was not going to be granted transit through Australia. So then we had to find which government would most likely let him make that onward journey. And for us, the simplest way in the end was through the Philippines. And even then, we knew there'd been issues with Iranian refugees at the Philippines airport, you know, not long before he travelled, and so that created extra tension.
I stayed there for 19 hours, then flew back. I was very close to Australia, but you know, that was not a matter for me.
Every time we knew Behrouz was arriving at an airport, whether it was in Port Moresby or in transit, or even when he arrived in New Zealand, those were the times we knew something could go wrong. We were watching on the plane tracker. We had people, you know, back in Australia watching his flight with great interest and trepidation, and every time we knew he got through the next hurdle, we were that little bit more excited, but a little bit more worried as well.
So when I arrived in New Zealand, I didn't expect that they, you know, search everything, but finally, yeah, they say, okay, go. Port Moresby in Philippines and in New Zealand, you know.
And now you're free.
Yeah, now I'm free, yeah. When I arrived in Auckland, it was very strange because for the first time, you know, I look at Manus in a different way. I was thinking about surviving, how I survived, and I was happy that finally I survived.
And just to finish up with the current story, a Tamil family who have been sent offshore.
Perth is a long way from the Queensland town of Biloela, the bush community that's maintained its support for a family that spent 3 years in detention.
We're just feeling really devastated and just really disappointed that they're being put into detention in Perth with no actual clear pathway of actually getting them back to Biloela.
The Murugappan family, Priya and Nadez and their Australian-born children, Kopika and Tarnika, being reunited today. The federal government has announced they'll move into community detention in the suburbs of Perth.
I had a very emotional conversation with Priya this morning after the announcement. She's seeing the move into Perth community as a positive step. So she is, very much looking forward to having a bit more freedom. There is, though, that anxiety of what's next.
The case of the Murugappan family has captured national attention over the past fortnight.
I want to thank everybody for their love and good wish, we hope.
The family welcomed being filmed by 7:30 on Christmas Island, just days before their 4-year-old daughter was flown to Perth to be treated for a serious blood infection. She is still receiving treatment at the Perth Children's Hospital.
It is really hopeful just seeing that she is getting her cheekiness back, which is lovely. However, she is requiring ongoing treatment and support.
Sri Lankan Tamils, Nadez and Priya made Biloela their home after arriving separately by boat in 2012 and 2013. The couple started a family while their asylum claims were being assessed.
They need love and care and nurturing to recover from what they have been put through. And that is exactly what we can offer them here in Biloela.
In 2018, immigration authorities determined they were not refugees and they were taken into custody. Since then, they've been fighting in court for officials to assess the refugee claims of their youngest child.
Priya.
Supporters in Biloela have remained in touch with the family, organising a national Christmas card campaign last December ahead of their 3rd Christmas in detention.
It's taken a 4-year-old girl to get seriously ill before our government is starting to look at the rights of the children, and at least, they've started to have a little bit of compassion now.
Minister Hawke had a very wide range of options open to him, from on the one hand permanent residence, various temporary residence visas, various bridging visas, or the community detention. He went for the least generous option. I can understand politically why he did that, but it also risks this issue just continuing to run in the media for long periods and possibly right through to the election.
Abul Rizvi was one of the most senior officials in the Immigration Department during the Howard government. He says the Immigration Minister, Alex Hawke, could let them stay with the stroke of a pen by using his ministerial powers of discretion.
Frankly, I cannot remember a case in the last 20 years that has had more community support than this one. So if community support is the key criteria for using the God powers, this is an open and shut case.
I understand why people might want this family to stay. You can't judge a book by its cover, but they look nice people, the kids look gorgeous, and they're here. But, our immigration system doesn't say if you're here you can stay. We'll be swamped if that's the rule. And it doesn't say if you're nice you can stay. I'm aware.
Former Liberal Immigration Minister Amanda Vanstone says the current minister needs to weigh up how other asylum seekers who've been rejected would feel if he granted an exemption in this case.
People to whom we say no and accept it. I hope they don't feel like suckers for accepting the decision.
The government argues granting this family permanent residency would only encourage others to seek asylum by boat. But back in Biloela, that argument doesn't wash with the family's supporters.
I totally disagree that the children are being used as a pawn for them to be able to stay and to support their case. So, yeah, I disagree with that, and the whole, opening the floodgates for more people to come over.
So in summary, the context of those 3 stories that I talked about, but also the Tampa Starga, the Pacific Solution, the Children Overboard, in the context of a longer history. So that's what historians call a longue durée, where you actually look at a story now and what Michel Foucault would call a genealogical search, where you drill down into history to find out how come we got to this point, actually reveals, exposes our attitudes to recent migrants. And I say recent migrants because unless we're Indigenous Australians, then we're all migrants. And we've considered that the original moral panic theory could be used to explain what happened, and considered increased opposition to government policies. But in my view, it's that continued bipartisan support at the very top. And it's going to need, I think it's going to need a division there before anything will shift.